Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you for joining us for our August Lunch and Learn. Our 2024 annual theme is Waging Peace. This year, we will look at the many different ways that President Eisenhower worked towards a global peace. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Jared Pack from York University, and he will talk to us about bilateral agreements. So thank you, Jared, and welcome.
Thank you. It's a joy and honor to be with you today for this conversation. During his 8 years in office, President Eisenhower and his administration signed and entered into more than 1,750 bilateral agreements with other nations, either through treaties, conventions, or executive agreements. A collection of agreements so voluminous that their contents fill 21 published volumes of more than 1,000 pages each, many of them more than 1,500 pages. And believe me, I know, I spent 45 minutes counting all the bilateral agreements in all 21 volumes just to write that sentence. These agreements covered a host of topics, as diverse as anyone can imagine. Everything from shrimp conservation and parcel service to atomic energy and economic agreements. And the countries with which we signed them spanned the entire globe in their reach. Yet the significance of these bilateral agreements went far beyond just resolving the matters of consideration upon which the two nations were agreeing. Whether in the form of a formal treaty or convention or just through an executive agreement, Eisenhower believed that any such agreement between the United States and another country was an opportunity to strengthen the bonds of friendship, enhance the depth of connection, and expand the influence and security of the United States, all without the use of force, weapons, or war. For Eisenhower, bilateral agreements were mechanisms for peace, for which he built the foundation of his administration's foreign policy approach, with its heavy emphasis on mutual security. By building trust and friendship with the other nations of the world, Eisenhower demonstrated the power of diplomacy and aid in waging peace. Yet any discussion of bilateral agreements has to begin with the why. What was the administration actually trying to achieve through state-to-state diplomacy? Why did they sign so many of these agreements about so many different things? The answer to these questions can be found in the two ideas we just mentioned, diplomacy and aid, which were critical for the construction of the Eisenhower administration's program of mutual security. Mutual security was the name for the United States program to promote mutual progress in military, economic, and moral strength among the free nations through military and economic aid. This program, however, was not new when Eisenhower took office in 1953. It had been established in the fall of 1951 by President Truman as a replacement, a next step for the Marshall Plan, which had offered aid to Europe to assist in the reconstruction of the continent following the end of World War II. Despite being a program created by his predecessor, Ike's years of experience in Europe had convinced him of its merits. In an NSC meeting, a National Security Council meeting, in March of 1953, as cuts were being proposed to the United States spending on mutual security, Ike argued that, quote, many of the European nations would certainly have gone communist had it not been for the money we had spent on them in recent years. We simply cannot afford to let Europe go communist. And while we may not have spent our money intelligently in all cases, we cannot now abandon these nations and these programs in Europe. It is the task of our leadership to make them do their jobs better, end quote. Thus, when Eisenhower took office in 1953, mutual security was not only a program that would continue, but it was expanded even further in its scope and identified as one of 3 major programs to be used by the United States to achieve its principal foreign policy goals, alongside the military program and the Atomic Energy Commission program. In many ways, Eisenhower's comments about the effectiveness of the Marshall Plan in containing communism and keeping it out of Western Europe were also indicative of his beliefs about mutual security across the rest of the globe. Indeed, the program was built upon the premise that, quote, the dangers, military, political, and economic, which are posed by the Soviet Union, will continue for an indefinite period in the future, and that the program, therefore, must be shaped as a long-range program designed to maintain the balanced political, economic, and military strength of the free nations for an indefinite period ahead, end quote. In light of such an assessment, the United States believed that by providing economic and military aid to the countries of the world, if done at a sufficient level and in a concerted and intentional way, it would be possible to build a stable, high-level economy and a global military posture that would, quote, make the initiation of war so costly to the Soviet Union that the latter will be deterred from embarking on such a course, end quote. From the American perspective, when the economies of the free world, that is the non-communist world, were strong and connected, when the militaries of the free world were strong, equipped, and connected, when the governments of the free world were ideologically aligned, the United States and the world would be secure and peace would reign. Yet such an ambitious program would inevitably come at a high price tag, right? The initial program had authorized nearly $7.5 billion, beginning in 1952. And under Eisenhower, roughly $3 to $4 billion of new funding were approved annually from 1954 to 1960. By 1957, however, such high levels of spending had come under the microscope of Congress, particularly among members of Eisenhower's own party. A program that in 1951 had passed with a 2/3 majority suddenly found itself in need of justification. In 1956, Eisenhower created the Citizens Advisors Committee on the Mutual Security Program, and he tasked them with studying and making recommendations on the role, scope, operation, and impact of military, economic, technical, and other foreign assistance programs in relation to the foreign policy and national interest of the United States. Now, it would be inaccurate to describe this committee of citizens advisors as disinterested or impartial, right? The president had convened them for the task of coming up with why this program needed to continue. Nevertheless, their interviews with key figures like the military chiefs of staff, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, CIA Director Allen Dulles, and Mutual Security Administrator Harold Stassen convinced them of the need for the program's continuation. In their final report to the president in March of 1957, the committee noted, quote, economic development is, in the long run, as important to the collective security of the free world as the military measures we have taken. They went on to state, your citizen advisors therefore conclude, Mr. President, that a collective security program will be essential for some years to come. It is in our national interest to be part of such an undertaking, and we recommend the program be continued so long as the present critical world tensions persist, end quote. And so, armed with the support of his Citizens Advisory Committee, Eisenhower spent much of 1957 and 58 defending the Mutual Security Program publicly and highlighting why his combination of military and economic aid were equally important for waging peace and promoting American national security. In Eisenhower's mind, quote, "These programs do more than any other, dollar for dollar, in securing the safety of our country and the peaceful lives of our people." End quote. Convinced of this truth, the president delivered an address to the nation on May the 21st, 1957, on the heels of a speech about the federal budget, justifying the billions of dollars spent on mutual security. Eisenhower noted that while the costs of the program might be high, the costs of war were higher, both monetarily and in human capital. He praised the successes of the program in places like Europe and Southeast Asia. He examined the imperatives of defense preparations and security treaties in the face of communist aggression, but also reminded the American people that poverty, which communism can easily exploit, could not be fought with guns, and hunger could not be satisfied with ammunition. To the critics who complained about how much money was spent on these programs, Eisenhower noted that it was only about 5% of the United States budget, which, considering the issues at stake, the president felt were a, quote, minimum figure. He then ended his appeal to the American people by matter-of-factly stating, quote, "To cripple our programs for mutual security in the false name of the economy can mean nothing less than a weakening of our nation. To try to save money at the risk of such danger is neither conservative nor constructive. It is reckless. It could mean the loss of peace. It could mean the loss of freedom. It could mean the loss of both." Yet this speech in 1957 would not be the last time Eisenhower had to defend this program and justify its merits. In 1958, Eisenhower once again found himself speaking on the subject of mutual security, this time to launch what an early draft of the speech called a nationwide educational campaign on behalf of a program that is vital to the survival of our country and the peace of our world. In this radio address to the nation and his public audience at the meeting of the National Conference on the Foreign Aspects of National Security, talk about a mouthful for a conference title, the president meticulously and logically laid out his case for why mutual security mattered in what is arguably his best defense of the program during his administration. Eisenhower was explicit and clear. Quote, "Mutual aid has repeatedly played a major part in keeping free world countries from losing their freedom. It has thwarted the communist hope of encircling and isolating us by taking over vulnerable smaller countries through aggression or subversion." End quote. After surveying all the ways the United States was investing in other countries, Eisenhower assessed the program this way. Is economic aid helping these countries to hold off communist attempts to turn discontent into subversion? Is it helping them to become sturdy, self-respecting members of a peaceful, free world community? Is it helping to win for all of us a secure and just peace? The answer is yes. Under current conditions, the urgency of both our mutual security and our reciprocal trade agreements legislation leaves no margin for error. They are not merely useful suggestions or helpful hints. They are iron imperatives of security and the building of true peace. What all of this shows then is that for the Eisenhower administration, any effort at waging peace must be done not through military might and the use of force, but through the combined effort of diplomacy and aid. Mutual security was Eisenhower's blueprint for waging peace. For all that we've said about mutual security so far, you might be wondering what this has to do with bilateral agreements, the actual topic of this presentation. And honestly, that's a fair question, given how little we've talked about bilateral agreements so far. Perhaps then it's appropriate for us to return to again use this blueprint metaphor. If mutual security is the blueprint for waging peace, then bilateral agreements are the tools used to bring that blueprint to life. In fact, in the same 1958 speech we just quoted, Eisenhower speaks of what he calls the mechanisms of peace. Things like treaties of friendship, international organizations, the promotion of mutually profitable trade, and the programs of mutual security. Clearly then, Eisenhower saw bilateral agreements as a critical component of waging peace. So what I'd like to do in the remainder of our time is explore several ways that the Eisenhower administration used these bilateral agreements to build peace, highlighting the different types of bilateral agreements used and the different purposes of these agreements. What I believe you will see is that for Eisenhower, these mechanisms of peace were a versatile tool to pursue peace across the entire spectrum of American foreign policy. And so the first of these types of bilateral agreements I want to highlight are treaties of friendship, which Eisenhower immediately mentioned when listing off the mechanisms of peace in the aforementioned 1958 speech. Treaties of friendship, as they're known, have a long-standing in American diplomatic tradition, dating all the way back to the 1778 Treaty of Amity and Commerce with France, signed in the midst of the American Revolutionary War, following the American victory over the British at the Battle of Saratoga. I'm guessing the Battle of Saratoga was not on your Eisenhower lecture bingo card today. By the time Eisenhower took office, the United States had signed more than 100 treaties of friendship with the countries of the world, and 9 of them had been signed since 1945. Of course, though, such popularity and use warrant the question of what exactly is a treaty of friendship. That's a valid question. I had to look up the term myself in preparing for this lecture. According to scholars within the field of international law, during the Eisenhower administration, treaties of friendship were defined as, quote, basic accords fixing the ground rules governing day-to-day intercourse between two countries. The name Treaty of Friendship designates the medium par excellence through which nations have sought in a general settlement to secure reciprocal respect for their normal interests abroad, according to agreed rules of law. End quote. Essentially, then, treaties of friendship established formal, amicable relations between two states, generally in matters of commerce, and committed the United States and its treaty partners to respect each other's rights and interests as friends upon the basis of the rule of law. Under Eisenhower's tenure in office, the practice of signing treaties of friendship continued at a similar rate. The United States formally ratified treaties of friendship with Finland and Japan in 1953, Israel, West Germany, and Greece in 1954, Haiti in 1955, although that treaty was withdrawn before being ratified. Iran, the Netherlands, and the Republic of Korea in 1957, Nicaragua in 1958, Oman and Italy, the Italy Treaty was revised in 1960, and Pakistan in 1961, which was signed under the Eisenhower administration, but not formally ratified until the Kennedy administration. This list of countries with which we signed bilateral treaties is interesting in many ways, particularly with regard to the geographic spread, the variety of size and circumstance of the countries involved, and the avowed willingness of the United States to treat equally any like-minded country. More importantly, though, the proliferation of these treaties, beginning with the idea of friendship and building toward the regulation of commerce and the rights of the individual, shows us how the United States sought to advance its own place in the increasingly interconnected world of the post-war period. As we've already established, the United States saw the creation of a stable, high-level economy as a major goal to promote not only its own national security, but the peace and security of the world. Through treaties of friendship, the Eisenhower administration created a base level to build upon its international relations and diplomacy. Treaties of friendship represented a shared commitment between two countries to respect the sovereignty of each other and to cooperate in the economic life of each other. In doing so, the United States expanded its network of friends and allies and brought new states into closer cooperation as a means of resisting communism and promoting peace. But formal treaties are only one part of the way the Eisenhower administration, and any presidential administration for that matter, manages bilateral relations with other countries of the world. Many presidents, I concluded, instead opt to use what we call executive agreements. Executive agreements are kind of like an international version of an executive order. They are binding international agreements made between the United States and a foreign power under the authority of the president, but they do not require the advice and consent from the Senate like a formal treaty would. By far, the overwhelming majority of those 1,750 plus, I think the number is 1,757, but after spending 45 minutes to count them once, I wasn't going to do it again to confirm that number. But the overwhelming majority of those 1,750 plus bilateral agreements actually comes in the form of one of these executive agreements. But their use of these agreements as a means of waging peace was in jeopardy in the early days of Eisenhower's first term, as an amendment was presented in Congress by Senator John Bricker of Ohio that was designed to curtail the power of the president in the conduct of foreign policy. Angry about the ways President Franklin Roosevelt had carried out personal diplomacy toward the Soviet Union, and concerned about the ways Congress was being sidestepped, the Bricker Amendment proposed severe limits to the power of the president to enter into executive agreements, while also placing restrictions upon how official treaties signed by the United States were entered into. Eisenhower immediately recognized the long-term effects of this constitutional amendment and vehemently opposed it. Yet, despite his opposition, Eisenhower was initially hesitant to publicly go speak out in opposition of it out of fear of dividing the party. Ultimately, though, Eisenhower realized that his public opposition was necessary to prevent its passage. And so in January of 1954, Eisenhower publicly condemned the resolution, stating that its passage would signal America's abdication of its world leadership. Abdicating leadership, of course, was a concept the world was familiar with very well in the early years of the 1950s. And so with Eisenhower opposing it, and support from Lyndon Johnson and liberals within the Senate, the Bricker Amendment was formally rejected in the Senate vote in February of 1954. Thus, Eisenhower had saved the power of the president in conducting foreign policy, rebuffing an attempt by Congress to assert themselves more fully into a realm that constitutionally belongs to the executive branch. More immediately, however, the impact of Eisenhower's victory over Bricker opened the door for executive agreements to become one of the most used tools in Ike's foreign policy toolbox. As such, we'll briefly look at three broad ways these bilateral executive agreements were used to wage peace. The term bilateral agreement, by its very name, is in many ways set in opposition and contrast to multilateral agreements. An agreement with one country versus an agreement among many countries. Yet in practice, the Eisenhower administration frequently used bilateral agreements as a means of furthering and protecting multilateral agreements. Perhaps no location is more indicative of this practice than in Southeast Asia. Following the French defeat in Vietnam, formerly French Indochina, in 1954, the United States was keenly aware of the prospects for the expansion of communism under Ho Chi Minh, to say nothing of the existing communist powers in mainland China and North Korea. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles declared privately that, quote, "We must hold the western side of the Pacific or it will become a communist lake," end quote. The sentiment was shared by the president and all involved in the conduct of American foreign policy. As such, the United States pushed for the creation of the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, SEATO, in September 1954, which was composed of the Philippines, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, France, and the United States. The challenge, of course, is that despite its name, only 2 of those 7 member states were actually in Southeast Asia. The multilateral treaty had created a basis for the promotion of security and peace, but its limited scope meant that it alone was not sufficient in protecting the region. So following the creation of SEATO in December of that year, 1954, the United States updated its foreign policy in the Far East, as embodied by National Security Council Policy 5429. This latest revision made clear that the work of SEATO alone was not sufficient to protect American interest. The chief course of action of American foreign policy in the region was to, quote, "maintain the security of the Pacific offshore island chain. Japan, the Ryukyus, Formosa and the Pescadores, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand as an essential element to U.S. security, and to assist in developing such military strength in each area as is required by U.S. security and is consistent with each area's capability and maintenance of domestic stability," end quote. In doing so, the goal was to not only ensure the preservation of the territorial and political integrity of the non-communist countries in East Asia, but to also create, quote, "political and social forces which will zealously spread the greater values of the free world and simultaneously expose the falsity of the communist ideological offensive," end quote. In light of these objectives, the United States pursued further bilateral agreements to ensure that this Pacific line spanned more than just the countries of SEATO. The treaties of friendship with Japan in 1953 and the Republic of Korea, signed in 1956 and ratified in 1957, are prime examples of the way that bilateral agreements were used to supplement, but also ensure the security of the multilateral agreement. In regard to South Korea in particular, official American policy from 1954 onward was to, quote, "continue military and economic assistance programs consistent with U.S. security interests and subject to continued ROK cooperation," end quote. Additionally, in December of 1954, the United States signed a mutual defense treaty with the Republic of China, the island of Taiwan, not the People's Republic of China on the mainland, That official recognition will not come until 1972. But we signed a mutual defense treaty with the Republic of China, which officially brought Taiwan and the Pescadores under the American security umbrella, and was a significant expansion of relations with the Republic of China beyond the already existing Treaty of Friendship, which had been ratified in 1948. We had the economic side covered, but in 1954, we add the defense piece to it as well. This step was motivated by American desires to secure East Asia and minimize the threat posed by communist expansion. When the People's Republic attempted to challenge the American position in January of 1955, Eisenhower showed that the United States was indeed serious about upholding its end of the bargain with Taiwan. While Eisenhower was committed to peace first and foremost, if China crossed the line the United States had drawn, the U.S. would have no choice but to respond accordingly. Ultimately, China backed down in the face of a potential nuclear strike by the United States, and Eisenhower had successfully balanced the desire for peace and the threat of force. What this shows us, though, is that these bilateral treaties signed in East Asia, like the Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan, were part of how the administration effectively used bilateral treaties alongside multilateral treaties to wage peace. Second, the Eisenhower administration also used bilateral agreements as a means of achieving broader objectives within American foreign policy, with arguably no better example of this than the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine was a response to the 1956 Suez Crisis and was announced in January of 1957. As part of this plan, Eisenhower promised to assist all Arab nations that were resisting communism and pan-Arabism, a doctrine advocated by Egyptian President Gamal Nasser. In many ways, the Eisenhower Doctrine was an effort to aid the pro-Western Arab nations. Again, part of the United States' overall policy of mutual security designed to maintain the political, economic, and military strength of the free nations. As such, the United States actively pursued increased ties in the region. Later in 1957, the U.S. signed a mutual defense agreement with Lebanon, pledging the two sides to closer military cooperation and bringing Lebanon within the orbit of the United States military power. Also in 1957, the country signed 3 different economic assistance agreements with the country of Jordan, as part of the commitment to improving the overall quality of life and practicing the economic containment side of mutual security. Most significantly, though, the United States signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia to renew American rights to use of the Dhahran airfield. This agreement had dated back to the 1951 Mutual Defense Agreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, which we had formally ratified in 1953. Yet despite this defense agreement, the use of the airfield was largely based solely upon good relations between the United States and King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. The 1957 agreement, however, formalized that access through an official executive agreement and ensured that the United States would be able to use the strategically significant airfield in the event of war or conflict in the region. In this regard, then, we see a variety of different bilateral agreements used in the Middle East in 1957. Military-related agreements, economic agreements, and a full-blown mutual defense agreement, all being wielded as means of strengthening ties and promoting the peace and mutual security of the world under the umbrella of the Eisenhower Doctrine. Finally, the last example I would like to look at of the Eisenhower administration's use of bilateral agreements relates to the specter of nuclear holocaust and Eisenhower's desire to harness nuclear power for good. In his famous Atoms for Peace speech in December of 1953, the president presented a vision of a world not characterized by fear, but of hope and peace. He proclaimed, quote, "The United States knows that if the fearful trend of atomic military buildup can be reversed, this greatest of destructive forces can be developed into a great boon for the benefit of all mankind. The United States knows that peaceful power from atomic energy is no dream of the future. The capability already proved is here today." End quote. He then committed the United States to the work of creating the International Atomic Energy Agency and sharing its technical knowledge and expertise with the other countries of the world to build and promote the use of atomic power for energy rather than in the unbridled buildup of nuclear weapons. Indeed, the Atoms for Peace program will be a hallmark of Eisenhower's foreign policy and one of the most significant and lasting pieces of his legacy. Yet it is easy to proclaim such an ideal. It is easy to deliver a speech and champion the peaceful use of atomic power. It's another matter altogether to actually implement such a policy. For Eisenhower, though, these were not hollow words or political theatrics. He stood behind this vision of a better world. And by 1955, the United States was actively pursuing these goals. In its policy paper on the peaceful uses of atomic energy, the National Security Council identified 6 action steps toward achieving our objectives, 3 of which involved the creation of bilateral agreements. Thus, from the perspective of the administration, it's clear that bilateral agreements were to be at the heart of how the United States achieved its broader objectives within the Atoms for Peace program. Yet not only were these agreements supposed to be part of the plan, a 1957 report on our progress in this effort indicated that the United States had been successful in this endeavor. The report began by noting that, quote, "The United States' lead in international cooperation has been maintained on 2 broad fronts. Bilaterally, through agreements for cooperation negotiated under the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, and multilaterally by the assumption of leadership and responsibility in the establishment of the proposed International Atomic Energy Agency." Moreover, the report highlighted that this effort was unmatched by other states as, quote, "None had approached the extensive and continuously growing program of the United States in Asia, Latin America, and Europe," end quote. Indeed, by 1957, the United States had signed 8 agreements of cooperation with the UK, Canada, Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Australia, France, and Norway, and were in discussion with 16 other countries from Latin America, Western Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The successes of the Atoms for Peace program and the efforts of the International Atomic Energy Agency were indeed a reflection of Eisenhower's ability to wage peace through bilateral agreements. By way of concluding today, I would like to reflect for just a moment upon one final question. What does all of this talk of mutual security and bilateral agreements actually help us understand about the sacred task of waging peace? I think there are 3 simple but powerful truths that we can take from Eisenhower's approach to waging peace. First, peace can be achieved one country or one person at a time. For all of the emphasis we often place on multilateral groups like NATO, CETO, the UN, the Organization of American States, you name them, the Eisenhower administration deeply believed that peace could be achieved through bilateral agreements. By building a relationship with one country, by reducing tensions with one nation, by extending an olive branch to one state, the world became a little more peaceful and a little less likely to go to war. In a world where it seems that there is so much strife and division and hatred, imagine the impact that could be had if every person applied the same logic to those around them. Where we all pursued peace with one person and one by one made the world slightly more peaceful than it was before. We do not have to bring peace to the whole world all at once to still make the world a more peaceful place. Second, peace is not merely about the absence of war. As we look at the types of bilateral agreements that Eisenhower signed and the money he devoted to mutual security, there's no doubt and no denying that a great deal of that was spent on military and defense matters. But it's equally true that the Eisenhower administration spent money on promoting peace and security by improving the everyday lives of people. To again quote President Eisenhower in that 1957 speech, the need for mutual security in waging peace. You cannot fight poverty with guns. You cannot satisfy hunger with deadly ammunition. Economic stability and progress, essential to any nation's peace and well-being, cannot be assured merely by the firepower of artillery or the speed of jets. The Eisenhower administration keenly understood that the task of leadership and the task of waging peace meant looking at the individual needs of countries and working in bilateral ways to meet those needs in order to create a more prosperous and secure world. Only when the material needs of people were met could the risk of radical ideologies and solutions be minimized, and in doing so, peace be achieved. Finally, these agreements teach us to never underestimate the power of friendship. We began our conversation about the different types of bilateral agreements by discussing treaties of friendship, one of those quintessential mechanisms of peace used by the United States. These treaties operated upon the basis of finding commonalities and shared ideals, even with countries very diverse from us. They committed the United States and the other signatory to abide by the same rule of law and international standards, and to do so not on the basis of force, but on the premise of friendship. It's easy for us to find enemies today. People who look different than us, think different than us, act different than us, and to quickly vilify them. Imagine, though, what it might look like if instead of always being concerned with enemies, we actively worked to cultivate friendship, to operate out of a place of assuming the good in others rather than the bad. What type of peace might we be able to bring to a world that is full of conflict and division? As a historian of American foreign policy, it is one of my deeply held convictions that the past is a lens to help us understand our present and consider the possibilities and prospects for a better and brighter tomorrow. So today I want to leave you with this challenge. In a meeting with members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, Eisenhower pointedly reminded them that, quote, we cannot wage peace just from the pulpit. You see, waging peace requires all of us to actively pursue it in our world, in our country, and in our communities. May we look for opportunities, big and small, to actively wage peace. And may we never forget the peace, that peace can be found in small steps, one-on-one interactions, and friendship. In doing so, we too can continue Eisenhower's legacy of waging peace. Thank you. All right, anyone have questions?
If you have questions in the room, you can write them down or you can stand up. And if you have questions online, you can type them in the comment box and we'll ask them.
How many of these bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements, or both, how many of those have been jettisoned and how many are still in effect?
That's a tough question that honestly I can't give you an answer to. I would have to go in and look at it. So for instance, CETO as an organization is going to end in 1975. CETO will no longer be in existence. It never is going to really kind of live up to what it was designed to do, the absence of many East Asian nations in there, the conflict in Vietnam. There are a number of things that are going to ultimately do in CETO. A lot of these other types of agreements are about very particular things, right? They are agreements about rights of navigation. They are agreements about the treatment of foreign nationals on the soil of a given country. And so they will be revised and changed over time, but it would be very difficult to quantify exactly which of those are fully still in effect, which have been changed, because they are constantly being adjusted to meet new realities.
How is this all done, running parallel with the United Nations?
So a lot of these things, in terms of the relation to the United Nations, a lot of these things are happening in a much more bilateral way, right? They're not the types of questions that warrant the discussion of the entire international body. For instance, if we're talking about things like the rate of exchange at which packages can be sent from the United States to a country in South America, right? Those aren't matters of the international body. So a lot of them are dealing with much more one-on-one conversations. Now, in terms of other international organizations like CETO, those are bodies that are doing some of the same kinds of things. Indeed, the premise of mutual and collective security is one of the quintessential components of the UN as an international body. Collective security, this idea that we, the various states of the world, commit to protect each other, is ultimately what dooms the League of Nations from the United States perspective in 1918, 1919, or 1919, 1920, and what, because of that failure, commits us so fully to it at the UN in 1944-45. So I think the UN is still providing the same type of international guidance for broad conversations, but how we achieve a lot of those goals in practice are happening on a much more one-to-one basis. Does that answer the question?
You made a comment that stated that these programs, bilateral agreements, took about 5% of Eisenhower's budget during those years to take care of those agreements, and what percentage of our current budget for the government is it more than the 5% probably, or do you have any idea?
I do not have any idea. I could probably, those numbers should be easily accessible. In 1957, when Eisenhower gives that speech, it's right at like 4.89%. By 1960, it's trending to about 7%, and that's going to be about the highest cap on it. As in the Eisenhower administration, and that's just again in what we call, and what we are terming the mutual security program, right? That is foreign aid, both military and economic. I'd have to pull the numbers to see what our current foreign aid, what percentage of the current budget foreign aid takes up. The premise that Eisenhower would make, though, and this is what he explains in both of those, is defense was still the largest section of our budget as it is today. Eisenhower was not opposed to spending money on defense, but he also was not going to spend a penny more on defense than he felt was necessary. We were not going to increase defense spending just for the sake of increasing defense spending. And so from his perspective then, we could spend this money on foreign aid and it represented less that we would have to spend on defense. Because if we find ourselves at war, the military buildup will be far more than 5 to 7%. So that's kind of the piece. But to compare that to present, I didn't pull those numbers.
Have we jettisoned any agreements with Russia? They're the USSR.
In recent years, or
Have we jettisoned any of the treaties or agreements that we had with the USSR?
very few bilateral agreements are made with the USSR during the Cold War by virtue of complete embargo. Some of the ones that do come into existence will be very particular in nature. We will see expansions of those following Helsinki in the 1970s, the Economic Cooperation in Europe, Organization for Economic Cooperation in Europe. But in terms of actually which ones would be in existence and which ones are not, we don't have, aside from the major international organizations, we don't have formal connections there. And in many of those cases, right, the Soviet Union and then Russia maintains, right, its seat on the Security Council and veto power in the UN. So those types of general agreements still exist. The structural piece is put in place. But without speaking to specific examples, I'm not sure I could answer the question of what might still exist and not officially on the books.
Well, part of the problem with Ukraine and Russia and NATO is they view Ukraine as a buffer zone.
Right.
And like we would view Mexico and Cuba and those South American countries as a buffer, how would we respond to, and we did respond to missiles in Cuba and missiles in Mexico and the threat of it? We aren't going to stand for that. Russia doesn't want to stand for that same thing in Ukraine.
Right. President Kennedy famously, upon finding out that missiles are in Cuba, says it's as if we put missiles in Turkey. And someone had to be the guy who said, Mr. President, we did put missiles in Turkey, right, under the contours of NATO. Right. But certainly that's part of it, right? And so especially when you then manifest that back into questions of identity and territory and security. One of the things I always tell students as I'm doing my classic lecture on the origins of the Cold War and how tensions emerge is that the nature of security dilemmas is that when one country feels threatened, they take steps to increase their security. But as they take steps to increase their security, it makes the other country feel less secure. So they respond by taking steps to make themselves feel more secure, which makes country A, again, feel less secure and take steps to be more secure. And so the security dilemma is a big part of it always. And particularly in the case of Russia, the situation is complicated because Ukraine is a former Soviet territory. In the case of NATO, that's exactly what NATO, though, was intended to be. NATO was intended and created as an organization for containment, of containing the influence of Russia. And so from the perspective of Ukraine, it's a sovereignty question, their own security. They feel threatened, but actions to increase their security by attempting to enter NATO inevitably trigger concerns in Russia. I don't know if there will ever be an answer to the security dilemma.
With the present candidates for and administrations for during this election in here, do you know what their policies, or have any idea on what each one of the candidates' policies might be as far as bilateral agreements and working, to what Eisenhower did? Do you have any idea?
I do not, and I don't want to speak to what their positions might or might not be. I think what we can expect, though, is that the basic contours of how American foreign policy is carried out will continue, right? Executive agreements continue to be a major part of how we conduct foreign policy. Many of them at much lower levels than the top, but certainly some of them in the same high-level, top-down kinds of ways, because they are the basis, right? They're one of these tools in the conduct of American foreign policy, and they have been for centuries. And so I would expect similar types of practice, right? Now, the question is what the content of those would look like, and that's what I won't speculate on. But again, so in the world of history, the difference between historians and political scientists is as political scientists make rules about how politics, international relations work, and historians show them why their rules are wrong. And so I'm hesitant in the world of history to ever speak to how things might play out. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that people are not rational actors. And just when you think you know how they are going to act, they act in a way different than what you would have expected. But I do believe that we could expect to see some of the same types of things. Executive agreements, bilateral agreements are a critical part of how American foreign policy has been conducted for hundreds of years. And I would expect that to continue.
What was the difference between Eisenhower and President Kennedy, since that followed that administration, as far as the bilateral agreements?
I would have
to.
I did not pull the numbers to give you a comparative point, although it's kind of somewhat difficult to compare because we're talking about 8 years versus 1,000 days. But certainly, we do see some big and distinct differences. In regard to East Asia, for instance, we are working on advancing and abiding by international law, but under the terms of the agreements at Geneva in 1954, following Vietnam's independence from France, the Eisenhower administration abides by the international agreement to only have less than 700 personnel on the ground in Vietnam. Kennedy very quickly begins to invest in new techniques of counterinsurgency, guerrilla warfare, other types of things. But he is going to do some of the same types of let's work on improving the lives of people. And so Kennedy begins to send in a lot of other personnel. He sends in engineers, he sends in all of these other types of things as part of trying to win the battle of hearts and minds. But what that looks like in practice is we go from the internationally agreed upon 700 to 16,000 by 1963 when Kennedy is assassinated. So we see some similarities and some continuity in places like East Asia. Kennedy is also going to start the Alliance for Progress in Latin America, which is going to continue mutual security style programs, right? Of doing economic and military aid as a means of waging Cold War. So we do see some similarities, but also in some significant departures.
Okay, I think that's all the questions in-house. Joy, do we have any questions online?
We do not have any questions online. Hold on.
Okay, well, I think Joy might have. Once again, I'd like to thank the professor for coming to speak to us today. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Dr. Pack.
I'm not sure if you can all hear me. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. You can hear me. Okay. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Pack. I do want to answer the first question someone asked about the federal spending. And from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, I did find less than 1% of the total budget goes to foreign aid. And that is broken down as 25% for humanitarian assistance, 21% for health programs, 18% for peace and security, and 18% for economic development assistance. So again, thank you, Dr. Pack. Thank you, everyone. We always want to thank the Jeff Cope Memorial Foundation for their generous support, as well as the Eisenhower Foundation. Our next program is Evenings at Ease, which is a movie night, Command and Control, on September 10th. And that will be shown in our visitor center, which is the other building, when you first get in, turn in. And then our next Lunch and Learn is September 26th, where we'll welcome Dr. Ben Green, who is with the Department of State, and he will talk about Eisenhower and the military-industrial complex. So once again, thank you again, and have a wonderful day.